everybody, and welcome to LCMB's High Performing Buildings Equals High Performing People webinar. This is the first in a series of short 30-minute webinars which cover the topics we consider most significant to our clients and the organizations we work with. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Joanna Watchman, the founder of Work in Mind. Good morning, Joanna.
Hi, John. Hi, everybody else.
So the format for today is a short discussion between Joanna and myself exploring high-performing buildings and workplaces. Then I'll give a short overview of our research and experience at LCMB of the impact of buildings on organizations and people. We'll then pick up questions, and you can email us questions at joe@lcmb.co.uk or by using the chat function on the bar on the webinar dialog box at the bottom. If you have any problems, as I say, just email Joe, that's jo@lcmb.co.uk. We'll pick up your questions at the end. And if we don't manage to answer all of the questions, by all means, email us and we'll respond after today. So by way of an introduction, Joanna Watchman is the founder of Work in Mind, which is a social purpose project she launched and self-funded in 2018, apologies. Her day job is as the MD of a communications consultancy specializing in the built environment and technology sector. Having spent years writing, thinking, and talking about the way buildings could, and should, be more in tune with the people that use them, Joanna decided to create Work in Mind to bring together all those who believe in smarter, more connected, human-centric buildings. And for those of you who don't know me, I'm John O'Brien, the founder of LCMB. We are a built environment consultancy that helps our clients make their buildings work harder. So Joanna, there's compelling evidence that suggests buildings can be optimized for performance through indoor environmental quality, biophilic design, and a range of other interventions. So why do you think not all organizations are taking these options to improve their performance in workplaces?
Well, John, I think, I'm really just a curator at Work in Mind, but what I've done really is to identify those 4 areas that I think kind of answer that question. I think the first I'd bring up is just general ignorance. More people, by which I mean more business owners, need to understand what this is all about. And I think to some extent, businesses are still getting their heads around energy and sustainability, believe it or not. And I think this is a sort of almost like a step too far. And I think if you're a blue chip and you've got a chief wellbeing officer, whatever, that's at one end of the spectrum. But for the many, this is a sort of a step beyond. I think the second area, which is obvious, is cost. You'd expect me to say that, but we hear it all the time. Businesses need to understand what this sort of thing costs and what they get in return. And it's all very well, I think, we see lots of examples of very big businesses doing these things, but what about smaller organizations? We're not all able to go to kind of well standard type levels. Thirdly, evidence. This is one of the things that we love to kind of show off about at Work in Mind. If we can get a great project to share, proof, ROI, the need for kind of really good post-occupancy evaluation, which I'm told is very difficult to get people to pay for. John, you'll be an expert on that. I'm just to say just a curator, but that is absolutely essential if we're going to kind of further the debate. And then I think lastly, what I would identify is this kind of it won't work here kind of mentality. So I think there are lots of end users, businesses who can't quite see how to take the lessons from bigger projects and deploy them in their own organizations, and they don't really understand how the projects could translate into their own businesses. So I think those are the kind of the 4 sort of main areas really.
And from your work at Work in Mind, do you think that attitudes are changing and that people are becoming more interested in the potential impact of workplace on well-being, performance and productivity?
Absolutely. I mean, I think you only need to look at the sort of the seminar schedules at shows like, I don't know, you might go to the Clerkenwell Design Week or Lux and things like that, and you can just see what's on the agenda, and you can see the number of people registered to attend and to listen. But I mean, generally, I mean, I'm very positive. I think there is a sort of a genuine interest, but I still feel that where things are lacking is that there's more clever people, you know, like yourself, you know, are needed to push the figures out there, to do the mathematics and to say, this is what's possible and this is what's proof. And I think that's the sort of the connection that's sort of missing. And, you know, we regularly get asked to publish stories about projects and what have you, but often they're from manufacturers of kit. And of course, you know, it's, if you're looking at the figures of and in terms of the ROI on investment, people are very you know, very sort of skeptical, I think. So we need good figures from quality sources, and then we all need to share that.
Our team at LCMB enjoy reading the sort of variety of articles and research and information that you put up at Work in Mind. So which topics do you see most interest in, and what are people finding most challenging, do you think, about delivering, you know, better quality workplaces in terms of people performance?
Well, I think it's pretty consistent what we find that people are interested in. And I've kind of got 5 areas that I've sort of identified that I think you'd all be sort of interested. The first is an obvious one. It's the standards, you know, anything on well standard, you know, people are interested in, but it's also kind of other stuff like reset, for example. So some of those sort of lesser known standards that are out there. So people are struggling to keep up with what's what, and I think that people are also terrified of not knowing what they think they should know. So I think that's a sort of key thing. Secondly, if we use any content around the P word of productivity, there's always a really big spike in interest on Work in Mind. So I think the challenge there, because you've asked me to kind of include the challenges, is that what people are looking for is, and I've had some interesting conversations with 1 or 2 big businesses about this, is how do you get a building, a space, an office, whatever, up to a kind of a consistently good standard for all types of people that use the space. So whether you're a Gen X or a millennial, or whether you're just shy of retirement, how do you get the space to work for the many, not the few? And I think that's a real challenge. And I expect you'll probably touch on this in your presentation. But again, I kind of go back to the point about productivity of, you know, we see a lot of content from manufacturers of kit that's used in building services, and you know that kind of always has an influence. It talks about the influence on productivity, whether it's, I don't know, lighting, aircon, whatever. But we do need readers, you know, our readers, whether it's architects or end users, they want kind of real hardcore evidence. The third area I would say that's of massive interest at the moment is air quality, particularly around CO2 concentrations and its impact on cognitive function, you know, productivity, human health generally. I mean, if we put anything on Work in Mind around that just kind of flies out the door, if you like, in terms of interest. So there's definitely a big thing there. So if anybody's listening, I'll have a look at the attendees list in a minute, but if anyone's listening who kind of operates in that space, I would say, or is interested in that, I would say you're not alone. I think the fourth area really that I wanted to kind of talk about is materials transparency. And I know that 1 or 2 of the attendees were at the launch of the Declare labelling system, which is something that the International Living Futures Institute have sort of created, which was launched last June at Foster and Partners. And the idea here really is that we understand better what the things around us are made from or covered in or whatever. So, and I think from a workplace perspective, if you think about you know, furniture, textiles, carpets, paint, things like that, all of these things have an impact on human health. And I've got a real kind of sort of personal interest in this for some reason. It's just sort of something that's kind of connected with me because it seems to make perfect sense. But I think there's a real people are kind of, I think some of our readers, I'd say the challenge is understanding what this is all about, understanding how to find, again, evidence and understandable information. And I think kind of the sort of fifth thing that's kind of aligned with this really is just generally, and I think, John, you've got some experience in this in your business, but is the impact that kind of VOCs and sort of the nasty stuff around formaldehyde, etc., can have on cognitive function and the sort of need for fresh air in offices and how that impacts on human health. And again, I go back to the big E word. The challenge is about how these impacts can be evaluated and measured, and then how do we kind of share that information.
So my final question to you, Joanna, is what would you throw out to those listening today and to the market to drive more interest in healthy buildings?
Well, I think there's sort of two things really. I want people to kind of demand more. I mean, if I'm doing this presentation in a sort of a different format and in front of people, face to face, I always kind of have a slide that says demand more. I think as we're all kind of sitting in offices all day and we're kind of consumers, if you like, I think we need to sort of generally, as a set of stakeholders, end user or as a specifier, demand more, demand better the workspaces that we have. And I think the other thing is, which is aligned with materials transparency and what's actually in the things that are around us. I would say ask more questions. If you're an architect and you're going to put paint on a wall somewhere, before you slap the paint on the wall, or the contractor does, what's in the paint? Does it have an impact on human beings? Ask more questions of the people who make the things that are going into our workspaces.
Okay, thank you, Joanna. I think an interesting challenge to us all. What I'm going to do is take about 10 minutes just to share a little bit of our sort of research and experience at LCMB that picks up a number of the, I guess, themes that Joanna shared with us there. So I'm going to start by, I guess, at the beginning and, remind us all that we spend over 90% of our working life inside buildings. I think all of us have felt the impact of great and poor spaces on our own personal performance. So intuitively, we know that the conditions of our workspace and buildings really do impact us. What's fascinating is that the recent research proves that this is the case. Research from the World Green Building Council 2014, from Harvard University in 2015, have shown the dramatic impact of CO2, volatile organic compounds, light, noise, daylight, and a number of other indoor environmental conditions on people's performance. Our own research at LCMB, Whole Life Performance Plus, which was completed with a collection of world-class organizations, including Oxford Brookes University, Nats, King's, Argent, was published in 2018 by BCO, demonstrated that by lowering CO2, we found that people think 12% more accurately and 60% faster. And I'll come on and sort of share the background to that and how that was evaluated and the impact of that later in my presentation. So BCO's summary of research has also identified in 2017 that there's potentially 2 to 3.5% productivity improvement available for organizations. And that's 2.5 to 3% of performance improvements per employee, which equates to 30 to 70% of annual property and operating costs. So we can see from the research, both in our field and in the health field, that there's potentially significant economic benefits available, as well as well-being benefits for individuals when workplaces are optimized. When we consider that for each £1 million spent in capital cost in the construction of a building or a workplace, typically over its life of 20 or 30 years, we see 5 million of operating costs. We see between 40 and 200 million of human costs. So it just makes sense to us to think about how we optimize buildings by putting people at the heart of buildings. And the way that we do this at LCMB and the way that we've done this with our clients is to start by focusing on what conditions do we require in the building or workplace to actually optimize people performance in terms of well-being, creativity, productivity, or output. So if it's a workplace, that would be quality, creativity, or volume of output of work. If it's a university, that would be student experience and staff experience, which drives student experience. If it's a hospital, it'll be patient experience. So once we've figured out what conditions need to be applied, either in an existing or new building, to optimize these experiences, we focus on ensuring that the building's optimized for delivering those conditions at the least resource use in terms of cost of operation, energy used, and carbon emissions. Once you've done that, then you can look at improving the value of the building for the organization by optimizing its utilization, risk, and flexibility. And then tracking performance over time allows us to continuously improve or compound these improvements. So our WLP Plus research, as I said, is published by BCO. It's available to download on our website or the BCO website. We've also produced a guide to delivering productive workplaces, which takes a number of the ideas from our research and our practical work with clients and gives us sort of template and guide to delivering productive workplaces. Both documents can be downloaded from our website. So I mentioned our WLP Plus project, and Joanna said that productivity and CO2 seem to be of real interest to people both in the sector designing buildings and operating buildings. So I'll just take a couple of moments to sort of explain the background to this and the implications. So this was a real life study, which is significant because the work by Harvard University and others is typically done in climate chambers rather than in the real world. We took 3 different buildings, typical examples of older buildings which had been refurbed with poor quality control, more modern buildings built in the sort of 90s, 2000s with reasonable control, and a more contemporary building which was built and accredited to BREEAM Outstanding. Our research found problems with the indoor environmental quality and conditions in each of the workplaces. So over a period of 2.5 to 3 years, we benchmarked the indoor environmental quality in each of the buildings, focusing on CO2, relative humidity, and temperature. We benchmarked the performance of staff by getting them to undertake cognitive tasks as a proxy for productivity. These were Stroop tests, numerical tests, and reading tests. So we had over 250 staff tested over 8,000 times in a baseline performance, and then we improved the CO2 by improving the ventilation rates, improving the temperature control, and relative humidity. And what we found was that in enhanced CO2 environments, test scores improved by up to 12% in terms of cognitive capability, and speed and accuracy of testing improved by 60% in lower CO2 environments. We found similar sort of relationships for temperature and relative humidity, not as dramatic, but we found that in all environments that we looked at in our research, and this is also being corroborated or validated in our more recent work with clients, that every building we looked at is suboptimal in some regard. Flowchart from our productivity guide groups together the workplace indoor environmental quality conditions to consider and the linkages to improving return on investments when you're considering existing and new workplace optimization. So as Joanna said at the beginning, indoor environmental quality in terms of pollutants, CO2, aroma, ventilation, moisture, thermal comfort, lighting and design, biophilic design, noise and acoustics, all of these issues impact the health and well-being of individuals in the workplace and lead to an improvement in terms of return on investment. Our approach to optimizing buildings to sort of capture these issues is twofold. So if we look at existing buildings, typically what we do is capture indoor environmental quality. We focus on air quality by measuring at a more granular level than the control systems in the building, relative humidity, temperature, CO2, but we go further than that and look at PM 2.5, which is particulate matter, TVOCs, and a range of other well-being metrics. That allows us to capture the quantitative data for the building In parallel with that, we do a staff survey to get feedback in terms of people's comfort and perception of productivity and performance. And we identify the gaps in the performance of the building by also capturing the other data sets which are available in terms of occupancy, BMS, and energy. And we put this on our platform and identify viable options for improving the performance of the workplace in terms of optimizing staff performance. We can then look at the sort of investment case based on the improved output and the cost of actually delivering that. Those remedial works can either be done in a trial test case, measured and verified before being implemented across the entire estate. Equally, the same approach can be taken for the design and build of new buildings. So using the models to dynamically model the performance of the building in work when it's on the design software, be it Revit or whatever form of BIM model is being constructed, and the same approach can be taken. So I just wanted to sort of finish with two sort of case studies which identified the sort of practical outcomes of the approach. Two different case studies, one looking at optimizing poor buildings, and poor buildings meaning sort of underinvested older building, which was originally built in the 30s, refurbished in the 2000s, and the loading came from about 12 meters squared per person to 7.5. So we applied our approach because there were problems with the environment and complaints from staff. And we found that, and this is typical of a lot of both modern buildings and older buildings, that there were very high levels of CO2 and poor temperature control. So analysing the building at this level of detail indicated problems with central plant fan coil units, and we were able to design a low-cost CO2 controlled ventilation solution that was viable in terms of the client's investment horizon and criteria. They were looking at a 5-year divestment of this building. And taking this approach and improving the CO2 and temperature control in the space improved the staff's cognitive performance by 12%. Another example, looking at a global financial services firm who consolidated all of their staff in London from a range of poorer performing buildings into a new state-of-the-art headquarters in terms of certification. And they were looking to essentially conduct a post-occupancy evaluation, so to examine how that building was performing in use. Again, we took the same approach, in installing more granular sensors to capture temperature, CO2, relative humidity, and a range of well-being metrics. And we found that, again, CO2 and relative humidity were issues for this building, making it suboptimal in terms of staff well-being and performance. And these are typical for modern buildings because relative humidity control tends to be depressed and CO2 doesn't tend to be controlled at a granular enough level. Also, when we examine buildings at this level of detail, we typically find problems in their design and operation. In this instance, we identified single sources of failure for the equipment feeding the trading floors, which introduced a business continuity risk. If the floors went down, there was substantial daily 7-figure losses to the organization. So the approach can be used to optimize existing buildings, identify optimum refurb options from existing buildings, or to create a post-occupancy evaluation and soft landing. And I think Joanna said at the beginning that one of the sort of perceived failures of the marketplace is the fact that we do very little in terms of validating the performance of the buildings once occupied, commissioning, and soft landing. So in summary, workplace optimization is proven in practice and in research to deliver between 2 and 3.5% of additional output per employee. So that can be significant. In a 200-person building with average cost per employee, that would deliver somewhere between 1.5 and 2.5 million of additional output over 10 years. So these, what look like small figures, can compound to be very significant over a period of time. Also, the World Health Organization research demonstrates that our buildings, if not optimized, are actually impacting our well-being and performance. Our recommendation is to focus very much on CO2, temperature and relative humidity, because the big wins will be in those spaces. And then once those are analysed and understood, looking at the other wellbeing metrics. And in terms of getting support in organisations, we would recommend testing, trialling and scaling. So testing small areas where performance may not be at its best, trialling solutions, validating those solutions, and then thinking about how they can be scaled across the organisation. So we're going to move on to questions. As I said, there's a number of reports and guides that can be downloaded from our website. The URL's on the screen there. There's heaps of interesting and varied information to be read on Joanna's website, www.workinmind.org. And you can email questions to me at john@LCMB or joe@LCMB. So I'm going to open up to the floor and just answer any of the questions that we've had. So just bear with me 1 second while I invite more questions and pick up the questions that we currently have online. So Joanna, can I just ask you, while I do that, if you have any immediate questions in response to my short presentation?
Yeah, I think for me, probably the question is how do you as a practitioner actually go about gathering, sort of indoor environmental quality data, and what's the sort of the process? I mean, I've talked a lot about the need for it, but I mean, how do you as a practitioner do it? I mean, what's the process?
So what we do, unless we've got a very unusual building, typically these days most buildings have a BMS, a building management system in them that's collecting data at sort of quite a high level. So what we normally do is we supplement the building management system by installing wireless sensors, which are sometimes referred to Internet of Things technology, but that's just a fancy way of saying sensors without wires. So what we'll do is we'll deploy sensors which measure temperature, relative humidity, and whichever well-being metrics we consider important. So we typically do TVOC, volatile organic compounds, PM 2.5, ozone, and we collect that with those sensors at a more frequent basis. So these days you can buy a pretty accurate sensor to allow you to do that level of technology at about £200 a unit. So for a normal building, we'd probably end up installing 14 or 15 of those sensors across typical areas. Then we'll ideally collect that data set over 2 seasons. You can do it over 1 season if in winter, and that'll give us an insight into how the workspace is performing in terms of indoor environmental quality. We cross-reference that with other data sets, and then that allows us to identify quite quickly where the building isn't performing. Does that give you a reasonable answer to that question?
It does, thank you.
Okay, I'm just conscious that we've promised to finish for 11:30, so I've got time for 1 or 2 more questions. So I'm just going to pick up questions from the floor. So I've just got one here which says, can we share any results on productivity improvements following your interventions on TVOC and PM issues? We don't have any direct data that I could answer that question with at this point in time, because we're doing some work at the moment around TVOC and PM issues. So I will probably be able to answer that question in about 8 weeks. So we're currently doing a piece of work with a small SME recruitment organization who has a problem with sickness in a business park office in the north. And one of the issues is TVOC and CO2. We're seeing less issues with particulate matter in terms of direct impact on people's well-being and performance, because typically the PM issue, particulate matter issue, is driven by air quality outdoors. So I I will capture the data from the study we're doing at the moment and try and answer that question. It will probably be in about 8 weeks' time. So at the moment, we haven't got direct data between productivity improvement and TVOC and PM. Our data is linked to relative humidity and temperature and CO2. So Joanna, there's a question just come in, so asking, do either of us have any experience with environmental psychology in building well-being? Are either of us aware or interested in the field? So is that anything that you've
I am
covered?
interested, and I certainly know people who are specialists in it. And I don't know whether the person asking the question is looking for a practitioner, perhaps.
So while they answer that question, so when we're talking about environmental psychology, I guess this cuts across biophilic design. Is that, so when we're talking environmental psychology, is that what the person who's asking the question means? I'm just waiting for a response. Hold on. So let me just explain our interest in this area, then I'll have to sort of summarize and close this out to deliver our sort of 30-minute webinar. You can continue to ask questions afterwards and we'll respond to all of the questions in writing and capture them in the summary from today. We've become interested in biophilic design, the concept of bringing the environment into building and its impact on well-being. So I'm the BCO lead with the BRE for the Biophilic Office, and what that project is looking to do is to create an investment case and the metrics that Joanna was talking about for the introduction of biophilic design at different levels into the workplace. So looking at low intervention, which is introducing colour and plants, medium intervention, which is perhaps looking at replicating daylight indoors, and a higher level intervention, which will be introducing ideas like psychoacoustics into the workplace. And what they're doing is benchmarking people's well-being in terms of sleep pattern, stress factors, and that research is due to be delivered later this year. I think there's a lot of evidence that suggests bringing the environment or nature into workplace and office has a beneficial impact. And I certainly, like many other individuals, feel that if you go into a building which is well designed and incorporates the environment and nature, it seems to intuitively or by evidence have an impact on my well-being. I don't know what you think, Joanna.
Yeah, I'd agree with all of that. I'd agree with all that.
Okay, so I'm conscious that we've promised to come in at 30 minutes. I haven't done a brilliant job as a chairman. I'm 3 minutes over. We are trying to make these short and snappy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to thank Joanna and the attendees for joining us today. We will be sending out a recording of the webinar. We will capture any supplementary questions that we haven't been able to answer and answer them in the pack. And there will be a copy of the slides available. You're free to contact Joanna or myself if you've got any follow-on questions from today. And I do encourage you to have a look at Joanna's website because there's lots of great material on there. So thank you, Joanna, and thank you for everybody for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, John.